Good evening, guys. It is Wednesday night, and yesterday Dota had a pretty big patch where there were a lot of hero changes, item changes, stat changes, two new heroes, which look really cool. And then there is a major tomorrow. It is Dota Pit. It is in Croatia, I think. So more 4 a.m. games tomorrow. I will most likely be waking up for it because it's really exciting watching a new patch and to see how teams utilize all the changes, and maybe if they play a new hero, I would really love to see how they play them at the top level. So those are really exciting. There's also a new game mode called Turbo Mode, which is a shortened version of a regular game where you get a faster experience, so you level up faster. You're able to buy items from anywhere and it'll just go into your inventory. And I think there was one other aspect of it that I forgot, but I played one game of it yesterday and it was about 20 minutes. And it was pretty nice because one of my biggest complaints about regular Dota games right now is that if people grief, where they're like feeding a courier or feeding kills, there's no surrender in Dota. So you have to just sit through the torture. And some people really like to keep trying till the end, but if I have somebody on my team that is giving the enemy team a huge advantage, then it's really hard to stay motivated for something like that. So in turbo mode, I feel like the fact that the game is faster and you know that the games are shorter, then you're less likely to maybe feel annoyed about the time factor if you run into somebody that is intentionally ruining your game. So that is something that is very exciting for the upcoming tournaments for Dota. Okay, let's see how long I can get Milo in my arms like this, all spread eagle for you guys. Next, I'm going to talk about the Blizzard interview and just the entire process that I went through. But before I talk about my most recent experience, I would just like to say that I applied to them actually a couple years ago. So at this time, I was still working as a quality assurance analyst. So this role is mostly testing, and I applied for a release analyst position. So I went through the whole process back then, and I actually got an offer from them. But it was an offer that was less than my current salary and required relocation to an area that had a higher cost of living. So the offer was $19 an hour. I believe their structure is just that they do a lot of hourly for positions because there tends to be a lot of overtime. And then after a certain point, you become salaried. But yeah, so the offer was $19 an hour. It was less than what I was currently making. And even though it sounded very exciting and everything to work for Blizzard, I did not want to accept an offer that was less than what I was making. It didn't seem like it made any sense to do that. And even back then, I was not a fangirl anymore of the company. So there was no strong desire to work for them. But that experience did give me the knowledge that they pay less than they should. And they do so because they know they have so many people that are dying to work for them. And I did not want to be one of those people. So when I applied this time spontaneously, I was not, enamored with the idea. And of course, when I thought about it and what it would be like to work there were moments where it got exciting, yeah. And a change of environment where I would mostly be working with gamers and people who would maybe be more similar to me. And having that factor, maybe I would be able to get along with them better or find more people that I would genuinely care about. So at the time, I was just talking to a friend, and every single time I go through this application process of wanting to switch jobs, I would be telling my friend, sometimes Blizzard would just randomly pop up, and I would just think, hey, maybe I'll just randomly apply and see what happens. And usually at that time, my train of thought is just, I will apply, but I don't expect anything to come of it. It's just, hey, why not? So to have it turn into something definitely was a surprise. So the timeline is basically I applied initially on October 2nd, and then 2 days later on October 4th, I got an email to have a 30-minute conversation with HR, and they had a convenient link in the email where I could just schedule the call instead of just going through back and forth to determine availability. So I scheduled a call for the following day, and most of the times the HR calls are very generic. They just ask about your experience, ask you why you want to leave, ask what you want to look for, why you want to work for Blizzard, general questions like that. HR people usually don't have much knowledge about the technical requirements of the job, so you don't need to worry about that aspect of questioning at all just yet. And then after that, she let me know that I would be required to take a take-home assessment. So I think when I had my phone conversation with her, it was on a Thursday, and she told me that I could have until the end of the weekend to do it. Someone looks so sad. Wow, why are you so low? She's so cute. So the assessment was 2 hours long. There were 8 questions. I have provided some screenshots that I managed to take while I was taking this assessment. It is 4 multiple choice questions, 2 SQL questions where you have to write a query for what output that they want, and then there were 2 other questions that you needed to code for. The languages that you need to use for those 2 coding questions are provided in the screenshot for what they expect. I was not able to get every single question. There were 2 multiple choice questions that I wasn't able to take a screenshot of. I think maybe at the time I was pretty confident about my answer for them, so I didn't take a screenshot. And then the other 2 are provided. For one of them, it's basically just asking what the output would be given the code that you see in front of you. And then the other one was basically kind of asking a question about threads. So for the 2 SQL questions, one of them wasn't very bad. It was basically like, given this one table with these requirements, output certain records, having it sorted a certain way. I don't have a screenshot for that one, unfortunately. But for the other one, actually, it sucked because it was poorly written. The way they have it written out, and I'm showing this to you here, is that it's impossible for a SQL query to be that way. Basically what they're asking is, if there's more than 5 records, give me this, otherwise give me this, but it would return 2 separate outputs. It wouldn't return the same data. So I think their goal with this question was, if there's more than 5 results, sort it by one column, and if there's less, you sort it with a different column. And they actually said that to me themselves during the in-person interview, that they changed up the wording after I took it because they realized that it was just not worded properly, and that sucks a lot because this is a timed assessment, and if somebody is struggling with a question because of it being worded poorly and therefore not being able to figure out the question, whereas they really want to figure it out. Like, I'm the type of person where for an assessment like that and you have 8 questions, I don't like moving on to another question if I didn't complete another one yet, because I just am a completionist. I really want to get it done. So for one of the coding questions that I was kind of struggling on completing all the test cases, that slowed me down. I think I spent an hour and a half on that coding question because I just really couldn't figure out why I wasn't passing the final test cases. So the one that I'm talking about is a question about ticket buying. So essentially you have an array and then you have a second input, which is a number that represents an index in that array. So for example, you have an array where you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's just say that the value for each index is +1. So for arrays, indexes start at 0. So let's just say that index 0, you have 1, index 1, you have 2, stuff like that. And what they want is for you to return the total amount of time it would take for a person to buy their ticket. So the question essentially provides you with a second input, which is a number, and that number represents the index number of the person that you want to keep track of. So this question basically goes, there are people in an array, and each value represents how many tickets they want to buy. And the rule is, once the person at the front of the line buys a ticket, they have to return to the end of the line. And every single time someone buys a ticket, it's 1 second. So what they really wanted me to do was to optimize my code. I had a very linear approach, so I was just looping through the array, and I would just keep looping through until the people before the person I'm tracking bought all their tickets, and I was able to determine what the time was for the person. Basically, my code was taking too long. It was looping through the array too many times, and the way they mentioned to optimize it during the interview was that if the person you're keeping track of has 3 tickets, the people in front of him only buy at most 3 tickets, and then the people behind him only buy at most 2 tickets. So I wasn't thinking about it in that sense, really. And the thing that actually annoyed me a little bit about the in-person interview was that they were pushing so hard for me to think of this optimization to my code. And I really feel like I'm the type of person that I like problem solving. I don't think I'm a bad problem solver, but under pressure when you are in an interview and all of those factors, they just are pushing you and pressuring you to come up with that answer, and I just wasn't able to think of it. So I think that was definitely a negative point in my interview. But hopefully the way I described the question was in-depth enough for people to understand what they're asking for. I do have a screenshot for basically what the process looks like, so I think once people really look at it and understand the pattern, then they will understand the question. Really, the question is not that difficult. It's just figuring out a way to not loop through the array unnecessarily, so you make sure that the runtime is pretty smooth. So when I entered in my code, I was able to run it against the preset test cases that they have. There are 3 test cases that you were able to see the input, and then you would also see your output and whether it was incorrect or not. But every test case after that, you don't see what they are, and they pretty much do it that way, so you aren't really able to know too detailed about what you're missing. So when I kept running my code, I would pass 9 test cases, and then by the time it reached 10 through 13, it would time out, which means that it's taking too long. But moving on to the next question, which I was not able to solve at all. So let me just kind of put it out there that they said that this take-home assessment is not meant to be solved completely. That was one of the biggest things that I was actually a little surprised about. I took this take-home assessment on Friday night because I'm an introvert. I wasn't really doing anything special, so I like to get things out of the way. Plus, I figured if I did this as soon as possible, I could get the process moving along quicker. So I did it on a Friday night, and by the time I was done taking this assessment, my brain was fried, and I didn't feel confident that I would move on because I didn't solve an entire coding question, so I felt like that was a really bad sign. And plus, I feel like I don't focus on things very well for long periods of time, so using my brain really hard for this assessment for 2 hours completely drained me. But, sorry, let's get back to the other question. I do have one screenshot for this one. So for this question, there are 2 inputs. You have one input where it is just a bunch of numbers that follow the same pattern. It represents a 3x3 board, and then the numbers pretty much go left to right, and then left to right, top down. The second input is a random assortment of numbers that you will want to traverse throughout this board, and you need to figure out how many steps it will take to go through those numbers. So if you have a number at the very top row and you have a number at the very bottom row, that counts as 2 steps to reach the other number. If you have a number in the center, it's 1 step for anything else. Hopefully that is as much detail as you need to understand the question. It gets just a little bit more tricky because you need to figure out the best way for your code to know where the numbers are located. And I actually went through this with my friend while I was prepping for my in-person interview because I wasn't able to solve it. I thought it would be good to walk through this problem and figure out the solution for myself. So basically we came up with a 2-dimensional array. The first index would basically represent the row, and then the second index would represent the column. So I did a first loop to first create the board and the layout. And then my second loop ended up going through the numbers you're looking for and would compare to the board to let you know whether it would be 1 space or 2 spaces away. Something that was given in the question is that the first move always counts as 0. But really, the whole idea behind the question is usually not so bad. It's just trying to figure out the best approach to it. Plus, there is the intimidating factor that all of these coding questions are like 5 paragraphs long. These questions are very long. Part of it is because they include several examples underneath the description of the question, but just when you click on the next question and you see that long ass question, you get pretty intimidated. At least I know I did. So overall, I think the take-home assessment wasn't terrible. It is very annoying to take. I personally hate assessments for my field. It sucks really bad that I have to take all of these when I'm applying for jobs because I feel like when you are actually working somewhere, they really are helpful and encouraging when you need to learn something new. But usually these interviews kind of give off that vibe that they want you to know everything already. And I know that's just to help filter out people who really know nothing, but I just think it's a very stressful interview process. It's very lengthy, and my strength has always been doing the work, not knowing details. So my biggest weakness when it comes to interviewing is when they ask basic computer science questions. Stuff that you would see in textbooks, like what is this? What makes this work so fast? Questions like that. And I know those are probably things that I should try my best to get better at knowing, which I definitely think I will. But I just feel like those questions don't really provide a good representation of how well you actually do the work. So that's just kind of my opinion after going through this process so many times. All right, so I submitted my take-home assessment on Friday night after I was done. And then by Monday, I actually got a response that they wanted to schedule roughly an hour interview with the 2 people on the team that I would be closely working with. I am actually really surprised by how quickly they responded to me. I read several interviews on Glassdoor that said that they worked extremely slowly, so maybe with that feedback they chose to kind of improve the whole process. I scheduled the interview for that following week, and it turns out that one of the members was not able to attend my phone call because they were working on the Destiny 2 release, and there were a lot of things to get done, so he wasn't able to be on the call. But I spoke with the manager extensively, and I think he mostly just wanted to tell me about the position. He wanted to get a better sense of what I'm looking for in the workplace, what my experience was, what I expected in terms of work-life balance. I asked him about benefits. So it wasn't so much technical. At most, technical question would be him asking me about my current projects. He did ask me questions like, if you could change one thing about your project right now, what would it be? He also asked me to explain to him times where I had trouble collaborating with someone and how I chose to solve that. That is a very commonly asked question, and it kind of doesn't seem like the best question, because I feel like it's really easy for somebody to give you an answer you want to hear. But yeah, that interview actually felt very easygoing. What I always like the best is when an interview feels more like a conversation than you just being grilled. Something that I guess was a little surprising was he basically told me during that phone call that they would most likely be inviting me on site. I guess with the whole process of recruitment, they were supposed to leave that to HR to let me know, but he basically told me that I would be getting an on-site interview. And yeah, based on that phone call, I did have a good feeling about this position in terms of it being a good fit. And then afterwards, I just had to provide my availability with HR, and then we would schedule my on-site meeting. So since my company does not let you borrow pay time off, I had to take an entire unpaid day off, and I pretty much just told them, like, pick a day and I'll take that day off. And I really didn't have many other conflicts except one other interview that I told them this day I'm not available, so they just had to schedule around it. But something that was actually interesting was they said that they would be overnighting a travel expense card for me to use for the interview. And I think that is a really nice gesture, but for my case, I didn't really need it because I just needed to drive north an hour and 15 minutes. But I got the package in the mail. This was pretty much like the letter I got. I don't really know if you could see much, but it just basically says, enclosed is an American Express expense card for $100. You may use this card for eligible travel-related expenses incurred during your trip. And then it tells you to refer to Blizzard Entertainment candidate travel policy, which they did not actually provide to me. But the interesting thing is that it just says, what if I don't spend the entire amount on the card during my trip? There is no need for you to return it. Please keep it to spend as you like after your interview. So to me, this card just feels like, hey, here's a free $100, because it doesn't actually provide you with restrictions for expenses. I mean, if you actually needed to use it, and they even mentioned that if you needed more money, like maybe you're flying out of town or something, then they would probably require your receipts and stuff like that so they could reimburse you. But for something like this, for a candidate like me, I just chose to not use it, and I'm probably going to use the card on like an Amazon purchase for a freaking litter box or something. But I mean, I thought it was pretty cool that they were willing to do something like that, even for a candidate as close as I was. So after it actually took a few days for them to schedule my in-person interview. I was really hoping for it to be basically the week after I spoke to the manager, but it turned out to be 2 weeks after, October 25th. So yeah, basically that morning I left pretty early, probably too early, but sitting in traffic later on I think would have been a bigger risk, and it might have taken me longer in terms of actual travel time. But I got there, I had to show my ID to the guard, and then I just parked in the guest lot. This was on the main campus. I went straight to the lobby and I sat there. I had to sign in using some iPad thing, and it was cool because after you signed in, a little printer on the side printed out your visitor badge, and after a couple minutes, HR stopped by to pick me up, and we walked across to the other building, which is where the team was at. From there, I met with the manager and the other team member that wasn't able to make the phone call in a huddle room, or a small room with a whiteboard, and we spent a lot of time talking about what the position was like. I feel like they really wanted me to get a feel about what they wanted for this position, what their goals were, and just what they have been working on. So getting a good idea of the entire picture was probably one of their bigger goals, and I think that is a pretty good thing because they want to make sure that you know everything coming into it, and they don't want to hide any aspect of the job. Of course, they couldn't get into specific details about how they did things. I think a lot of this first meeting was similar to what I talked about on the phone, but since the other team member wasn't there, it was just good to kind of go over things again. So we talked about my experience. We also delved into stuff like what I had issues with at my current job, and I felt like they really appreciated my honesty. One of the team members just said that I articulated that stuff really well, and he said that a lot of the points that I brought up were interesting. Something that was slightly irritating was that they kept trying to get me to suggest ideas of how they could make integrating stuff better. And I did mention stuff about documentation, and that is something that is a big issue with my current job. They don't document many things. But anyways, I mentioned a lot about how documentation could reduce like the need for interacting with somebody because you have all the information provided to you. But aside from that suggestion, they just wanted me to come up with something else. And I was saying how if I don't know like the technology that they use, I don't know like I don't have in-depth understanding of their systems, I couldn't provide anything from that front. So I feel like it's sometimes really unreasonable for them to expect you to come up with some grand ideas on the spot. I know that I can't do that very well. I'm sure other people can, but that's definitely not something I'm a big fan of. They also kind of started trying to ask me some technical questions. They wanted to talk about protocols, namely HTTP, but since I wasn't really familiar with it, they kind of segued into asking me what my personal project would be like. So I ended up talking about a movie list project I was working on with my friend. This was done in Symfony though, and they weren't too familiar with it, so they kind of just had me write on the board like what my databases would look like, maybe some of the SQL queries that I would be using to grab data from there. And they were kind of asking me questions about like what kind of data type you would use, what about IDs and stuff like that. So this first meeting was less technical, but they kind of really went into getting to know you as a person, asking you what you wanted. And after this, I went to lunch with 3 individuals. One of them was in the first meeting, and then the other 2 were, I think, project managers or maybe senior engineers that worked closely with that team. I was given a choice between the main campus cafeteria or this local restaurant that was right across the street from the building we were in. So I guess since I figured I might as well see more of the campus, I chose to eat at the cafeteria. So we walked back across to the main campus. The cafeteria was pretty big. It had a lot of different options. They had a salad bar, they had like a grill area, there was soup. It was just like a nicer cafeteria that just had a variety of options, and they paid for my lunch, which was nice. So I made sure I got a drink. Usually I don't get a drink because I just drink water, but since they were paying, I just had to make sure that I took advantage. But yeah, we sat down and they were kind enough to give me a couple minutes to eat without being interrogated. But then it resumed again. They were asking me about what kind of teams I've been on, whether they were big or small, and how I pretty much interface with them. They also asked me questions like, you know, what are your concerns for working here? They asked me about what my complaints were at my old company. So there's always a lot of the same questions because you're meeting with different people. So they will want to ask you the same question firsthand to hear your answer because they weren't a part of the previous interviews. So that's just something to keep in mind, that you will be answering a lot of the same questions. You will be providing the same answers. And after they kind of asked a lot of those behavioral questions, they were wondering if I had any questions for them. So I just asked them, like, you know, how did you get started? Like, what position were you in? And then we also talked a little bit about games because, of course, I would imagine the majority of the employees there play games. So we talked about how I have pretty much played every single Blizzard game out there. We talked about Diablo 2, some Overwatch. I told them about WoW being the game that I've played the longest. It's actually definitely my favorite game, I'd say. My fondest game. I wouldn't say it's my current favorite game, but I was totally in love with it back during BC for sure, and Wrath of the Lich King. But yeah, so that lunch was an hour and a half, and then after that we had to walk back across to the other building, and I met up with 2 software engineers for the first part of my technical interview. So the first question they asked me was to figure out the highest step you could achieve. You are given 2 inputs. The first number is the number of actions you can take, and then the second number is the number of the broken step. So a question like this is better to be viewed visually. So I'm sorry that I have to explain it to you. So to better understand the actions part of it, you can either do nothing or you can do the amount of steps. So say for example, the first input is 3. You have 3 actions. So the way that the question was written is that for the ith action, you take that many steps. So on the first step, you will always take 1 step. Second action, you take 2 steps. Third action, 3 steps, and it keeps going up like that. Of course, this is not realistic because no human can go up 6 steps at once, but regardless of that, so at any given point, you can either decide to take no step or you take the amount of steps that you're given. And depending on the number of the broken step, you have to determine whether you need to adjust previous actions to solve that. So I don't want to go too long into explaining this question, but basically to really optimize it initially, you would just want to think that if you determine that you hit the broken step, you only need to modify the first step. That way you lose the least amount of steps taken. And then if you dislocate where you land by 1 step, you will always just not hit it, right? But if you wanted to further optimize that with like a really large input, they were saying how you would use the formula, which is n times n minus 1 over 2. And then you would pretty much use that formula to determine if the broken step is within the steps that you would achieve. So yeah, with that formula, you would just use it to determine whether the actions you are given are less than or greater than the broken step. So if you determine that it is greater than the broken step, you just kind of like, they mentioned that you would use a binary approach where you would keep like dividing it by 2 and narrowing it down until you reach the point where you can determine whether you hit the broken step or not. After that, it was more like an architecture question. So they asked me to really design what an accounts thing would look like. So this was also databases. They also asked me to write a couple classes and functions that were supposed to retrieve and set information in this database. So some of this was similar to what I went over in the first meeting. They asked me, you know, how I would be linking the tables together, how I would reference them, and stuff like that. So they did ask a couple questions like, what is the difference between a public and private variable? They didn't want you to write out the whole thing. They just wanted to see if you had a good idea as to how you would be using the function. And that technical interview was an hour long. I feel like I do a pretty good job at making sure I'm not standing there in silence. If I don't know something, I will definitely let them know, and then they can suggest things that can get my mind going for what the solution might be. But yeah, those people I enjoyed interviewing with because they didn't like make me feel stupid or something. But after that, I had my final technical interview with 2 guys. They really just wanted to go over the take home for half of it, I guess. The other half, they asked me textbook computer science questions. which I mentioned earlier, which is like, what is this? Explain this. Why might this be better? What are the differences between these languages? Questions like that, which I was very terrible at. So I'm pretty sure that was a large reason why I was rejected. But yeah, they spent a lot of time going over the ticket buying take-home question. They wanted me to optimize my solution to figure out why I had the timeout problem. And I just couldn't come up with anything, and they really kept pushing for me to come up with the answer for that, but I couldn't really come to a good conclusion. After that, they did talk a little bit about the sequel question that was worded poorly. So we kind of discussed how it was supposed to be understood. I think they mentioned that the way that I answered it was supposedly correct, which I'm surprised about because I don't think I wrote anything very useful. I don't recall writing anything very useful because the question was worded very poorly, and it was basically like an if-else in a sequel, which isn't very possible. So that was also an hour long. So after the final technical interview, I was supposed to meet up with HR again, I think, for a tour of the campus, but since I don't know if there was a mix-up or something, but one of the team members from my first meeting ended up walking me around. I guess the part of the reason it wasn't so great was because he actually wasn't too familiar with everything and where everything was. So he seemed very confused about where to find something, but I did see a lot of interesting stuff. He kind of walked me back towards the cafeteria, showed me their gym. Their gym is a decent size and it has a good amount of stuff in there, so I really love the idea of an on-site gym, because if I'm sitting at my desk for 8 hours a day at work, a lot of the times right now, I just feel like I'm sitting there and like I'm gaining weight every second that I'm sitting there because I'm not doing anything active. So a big thing that I would love to do someday is work out during the afternoon to break up my day. That's a big part of why I feel like working remote is amazing. Any single time I'm out of the office during the day, I feel like I just got out of jail. So during lunch when I come home to walk Riley, it feels like I'm a free person for a short period of time because I'm not like chained to my desk. I know technically I'm not chained to my desk, but I, for some reason, have that idea about work that if you're like wandering around, not at your desk doing work, then you're kind of just jerking off or doing nothing. So I think that's definitely not true, but it sucks in that sense because I don't get up from my desk as often. I only get up to get water, get a drink, get a snack, but I don't get up to like take a walk outside, and I want to do that more often. So if I had a remote job, that would be amazing because I wouldn't be stuck having people kind of like judging me maybe about what I choose to do and when I choose to do it. I always think what matters is what work you get done and the quality of your work, not how much time you spend socializing with people or how often you are at your desk doing hard work or how much time you stay past 8 hours in the office just to look like you're being a hard worker and prioritizing that work, but maybe you're just really slow at doing your project and you could probably do it in a faster amount of time. But back to Blizzard, they showed me the gym. They also had a volleyball net, which is very close to the cafeteria, which is pretty cool for people to indulge in that. They also had a small library, which consisted of like game books. I saw some game guides. So books on that, they had some board games, they had movies, they had video games that you could check out. So I saw stuff for like Banjo-Kazooie, N64. That was one of the first games that I really loved, but I never beat it because the later levels were so hard. So they had that, they had a bunch of different video games for different consoles you could check out from there. And it was pretty cool. They had a sword in there from one of the games. You're not even supposed to touch it because I think it's real, but the team member touched it. He's like that person on Reddit with those GIFs where some woman touches like a Christmas tree and you see a sign on the wall that says you're not supposed to touch it. But yeah, we walked around. Most of the statues that they had, or figures, I don't know what you would call them, they were taken to BlizzCon already because it was the following week, aka 2 days from now. And I was able to see a few though, so I took a few pictures of that. And the orc statue in the middle of the campus actually was much smaller than I thought. I think they measure its height to the top of the axe, because like the orc is like raising the axe up like this. They say it's like much taller than it appears basically, but after that he really just dropped me off back near the lobby and I just walked back to my car and left. And then I heard back from them about 3 business days later. It was a courtesy call to just let me know that I didn't get the job, which is fine. I think that's better than just never responding ever again. But anyways, yeah, that was a really long day. I had never done a full day interview like that before, so I was really exhausted, and I already felt like by the time lunch was over, I just was feeling kind of blah about it. I feel like it's definitely too extensive. I don't know if, I know that they want to make sure that you're a good fit and everything, but I feel like you can achieve a good read on somebody much faster than 6 hours. But anyways, at least I got a tour of the campus, I guess. I've never been particularly interested in something like that. I really hope that what I provided today is really helpful for anybody that is looking to apply to Blizzard. If you have any additional questions, please just leave them in the comment section and I will always get back to you, I promise. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.